traditions in research methodology: positivist or quantitative, interpretivist or qualitative, post-positivist or critical. If you look at these three research traditions, in terms of ontology, all three traditions look at the domain-specific knowledge and any knowledge that are general but relates to the domain. The domain could be business, engineering, medicine, law, and so forth. Epistemology is about classifying that knowledge and identifying attributes of knowledge. In identifying and classifying knowledge as attributional knowledge or categorical knowledge, in the positivist or quantitative tradition, they are identified in relation to absolute reality or a single reality. In the interpretivist tradition, such classification and attribution of knowledge is relational because there can be multiple realities. Therefore, the categories of knowledge and attributes identified out of the domain-specific and domain-general knowledge are related to a given context. Under the post-positivist or critical tradition, the classified knowledge and attributional knowledge are a way of uncovering the reality that exists now to show that the reality that should exist is different. So such uncovering of classified and attributional knowledge can arise from the positivist domain or from the interpretivist domain for the critical analysis. Axiology is about the researcher bringing the values into the investigation. In the positivist tradition, there's an underlying assumption that the researcher stays away from imputing any values into the data. Therefore, it collects data that are objective, that can be identified by anyone, but the values of those data will not change from the identifier from one researcher to another researcher. In the interpretivist tradition, because the reality is co-created due to the interaction of the phenomena with the actors and also with the researcher, because the researcher goes out to find that reality, the researcher can bring her or his values into the investigation, gets value laden. So the data are not database, but the data could be data influence. For example, in the positivist tradition, in the post-positivist and critical tradition, again, the data are value-laden because when the critical researcher examines this data, whether they are data which are objective from the positivist tradition or whether they are value-laden because they are subjective data because they are value-laden in the interpretivist tradition. In that examination of data by the critical researcher again brings a value proposition, her or his value proposition, into the investigation because there's an underlying assumption these data are representing a reality, and that reality is a suboptimal reality, and therefore there has to be change to reach the full human potential. When it comes to theory, a body of knowledge, in the positivist tradition, it uses the body of knowledge, body of findings, or the knowing and any investigation that is carried out test out the current knowing to examine this current knowing is still valid, whether the phenomenon could be explained by the current knowing. So it tests the theory. When it comes to interpretive or qualitative research, it can qualitatively build a theory, a knowing, or use an existing body of knowing, a theory, to interpret its findings, or use an existing body of knowing to test out. But that testing is done qualitatively. That means there is ontological, epistemological, and axiological philosophical base which has a value-laden proposition, where the reality is relational. There can be multiple realities, and it tests out a given reality that is co-constructed by the actors in the phenomena. In the post-positivist or the critical, it uncovers the oppression and struggle. And then it presents that the current reality is suboptimal. So each tradition can form its own way of knowing. That means each tradition can have its own set of theories. Sometimes these theories overlap across traditions. When it comes to methodology, positivist tradition is to test a theory In the interpretivist tradition, it is to interpret findings or data, and in the post-positivist critical tradition, it is to critique the data and findings. The methods that are used to collect data and analyze data in the positivist tradition, it measures attributes of a given object without the researcher's intervention, measures it with an instrument that anyone can use. Therefore, that instrument becomes objective and the measure becomes objective. When it comes to interpretivist tradition, the measuring of attributes can change because that measure of the attribute can be influenced by the actors in the phenomenon, in the occurrence. Therefore, any measures that arise from that measurement is dependent on the actors who are involved in the phenomenon. And such measurement arises due to interaction, including the researcher, because when the researcher wants to uncover the reality, the researcher also influences such measurement and therefore the measures that results from that phenomenon to explain the reality. In the post-positivist critical tradition, it uses the data, whether it is without researcher's intervention or with researcher's intervention, that this data in either way is representing a suboptimal reality and it critiques the status quo. When it comes to positivist tradition, the findings are generalized using probability. A sample is taken and then it is generalized into a population using a probability of occurrence. In the interpretivist tradition, it says it is contextual because the data that has been measured is measured based on the contextuality of the actors who are involved in the phenomenon. The generalization of findings is not based on the probability, but based on the naturality of the phenomena or the transferability of this phenomenon into another context, or through the analysis of the findings, coming up with themes, and these themes could be relevant to other contexts, and intersectionality, where such findings are relevant not only to one section of the analysis, but into other sections. For example, It's not relevant not only to one nation but to several other nations, or it's not relevant not only to one community but to several other communities. When it comes to positivist, post-positivist critical tradition, these findings are about showing suboptimal reality and to show that the reality has to be radicalized so that a full human potential could be garnered from a new reality.